G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Welcome back to the Financial Bloke's Wealth and Wisdom podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing the cost of stress and mental health on your family's agribusiness, and more importantly, the tools you can use to build resilience and use stress to drive you forward. Stress, it's kind of like an oil leak on a piece of machinery. You might get away ignoring it for a while, but if the leak gets too bad, or if it goes on for too long and you don't fix it, then more likely than not, you'll end up with a blown motor or something else, which probably happens at the worst possible time and will be bloody expensive. You see, stress just seems to sneak up on you. It's compounding away, and then one day you're in a hole, struggling to find a way to dig yourself out. Over the last 2 years, I've been approached by an abnormally high number of families on the land who've hit roadblocks, and a major cause of their problems can be tracked back to stress-related issues. The interesting thing is that many of these families aren't struggling financially. They're actually highly successful. They're just stuck. Stress and mental health seldom present as what you'd consider a full mental breakdown. Often they present as things such as loss of drive, or someone being more cranky, or they find themselves stuck in a rut, unable to find the right mindset to pry themselves free of the problems they're facing. If you don't have the tools to build your resilience and effectively deal with the root cause, then it's not only shit for you to have to deal with, but you're going to be shit to live with as well. Family life will be impacted, succession plans can be derailed, and business profitability will suffer. For high achievers, this is often a difficult place to find themselves, and it's often tinged with a feeling of shame and embarrassment that they just aren't firing on all cylinders. You know, they say things like, I've been pushing it or I'm smashing it or something like that for so many years. What's wrong with me, Ben? I just don't seem to be able to motivate myself like I used to, or I seem to be making poor decisions. I've been thinking deeply about this for a long time, and to be frank, I'm always frustrated that I haven't got the qualifications, I'm not a psychologist, etc., to be able to have all the solutions. Now, I know some of the solutions, but I want to know more, and that brings us to our guest today, Letitia Cross. Letitia and I studied together at UNE way back in the day, so I've known her for a long time. She's a top chick and she's passionate about rural mental health. She's the Rural Mental Health Coordinator for the Rural Adversity Mental Health Program, and I'm excited she's here with us today. So without further delay, welcome Letitia.
Hi Ben, lovely to be on.
So let's just dig right into this first. How did you go from the corporate ag world back to uni to study a Masters of Psychotherapy, which again, I had to Google. I just said to you before we started, I had to Google what psychotherapy was.
Look, Ben, before we jump in, we just might put a trigger warning up front that some of the things we might discuss today might hit a little close to home for people, and that's okay. But if it does, know that it's okay to reach out for help. You can go and see your GP and talk to him. You can reach out to a professional like one at RAMP or another one, or you can alternatively call helpline like Lifeline, 13 11 14.
Perfect.
So, Ben, I suppose it sounds like a bit of a jump, mate, doesn't it, to go from ag? But look, I grew up on properties and droving, and I always had a passion for agriculture, and I worked as a commodity trader and then in catchment management and lastly in research and development uptake for the cotton industry. And so I loved that, but I was successful at that because I was always interested in what made people tick. That was the bit. I worked with a lot of challenging teams, so that was one of the things that made me successful in that. But I got really sick of watching people in my community, friends, family, colleagues, clients, people in the broader community suffer in silence around mental health. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of people and we are losing people to suicide because of that. So I suppose that's what drove me into this, and it's strange. There's a lot of core skill sets the same, but I worked as a therapist working around rural men, and intergenerational trauma was two of the things I did a fair bit of, and then walked into this role with RAMP and which is about awareness and education and having the conversations that helps put support around people, because I was sick of that, and I actually wanted to become a part of the change I wanted to see in my community. So that's why I made the change.
Excellent. Now, the thing with mental health, and there's quite often a lot of stigma around the word stress or mental health. And what I've found over the years is that even high-performing people can be suffering from stress or burnout. It doesn't necessarily have to be anxiety or depression, etc., debilitating. It can just have an edge to it that causes life to be a lot more difficult. So how do you identify someone who is, or how do you identify yourself, I suppose, someone that's suffering from either stress or mental health issues?
Yeah, I think it's really important to clarify that whole mental health thing, because mental health is the good stuff. It's just like our physical health. It's the stuff that we are trying to look after so that we're less likely to develop illness, right? So, and we're on a continuum. We're rarely 100% well and 100% unwell. We're somewhere, depending on what's going on the day, the week, the month, the year, sometimes the hour. Yeah, that can impact. Physically, we can slide up and down that, but mentally we can too. And we often don't think about it in those terms. We don't think about it being equivalent to our physical health. So, yeah, mental health's that good stuff that we're trying to look after. And the interesting thing about mental health is that the World Health Organization tells us that it's a state of well-being where we can cope with our normal stresses, work productively, contribute to community and realise our abilities. So stress is a huge component of that, and how we manage that is a really large component of that. And because of where we live in rural and remote Australia, we're exposed to adverse events, I suppose, and impacts. And we've seen a lot of chronic type stress. So drought is a really good example of that, where it's got that creeping impact. It sort of sneaks up on you before you realise how bad it's affecting you. Or we've also seen a lot of cumulative stuff lately. So waves of things, one on top of the back of one another. We've had, drought and fire and flood and pestilence and more pestilence and
interest rates, cattle prices.
Yeah, you name it. And we're not getting that gap now between those events where we can recover. So we're finding that we're getting worse driven into the ground. So people, when they're going through a bad patch, so a dry patch, for example, we're going through a drought, they focus on that line of, it'll be all right when it rains. Yeah. And they drive themselves into the ground, don't invest in themselves. And the problem is that it doesn't rain. It doesn't rain cash. It doesn't rain new stock. It doesn't rain crops. And often our decision making is much more complex at that point. So it's a really important thing to invest in that stress management, and also as an active part of our mental health and looking after our mental health so that we can stay up on the right end, that well scale. Because if we don't, we see fatigue, we see burnout, and we see illness develop if we slide down that scale down to the unwell end. And mental illness, we use mental health and mental illness as interchangeable terms often, and they're very different. As I said, mental health's the good stuff. But illness, what we know about illness is it's both common and treatable. We know that 1 in 5 Australians each year will develop a mental illness. When we blow that out to our lifetime, it's almost 1 in 2. So if it's not you, it's me, Ben. That's how common it is. But we don't talk about that. And the challenge is we don't invest in ourselves and we don't ask for help. Yeah, we're pretty bad at that rurally. And so we also know of those stats for Australians, only 30% of people seek help, which is really 2/3 of people with an illness aren't seeking help. And imagine if that was cancer or diabetes, yeah? It has a huge impact, and the more rural and remote you go, the less that figure plummets. And what happens is it means that people, particularly in rural and remote areas, are more acute when they get to help. And the other thing is that we are losing people to suicide, which is really, there's some startling figures around that. So we're losing 9 Australians a day to suicide. 7 of those are men, 2 are women. Rural people, our rates are twice as high, but for a rural bloke, he's 3 times more likely to take his life to suicide than his mate living in an urban area. So there's some really they're really sobering facts. But I think it's important to look at that. That's the other end of the scale if we don't make an investment in ourselves. And it really puts in focus for me why it's important for us to do it.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm seeing more and more burnout in high-performing people as well, Letitia. So, not falling deeply into a hole, but just that high-performing, lots of pressure, lots of complex decisions to make, and then you just see the edges starting to get a little bit ragged, and they start saying things like, I'm not as motivated, I'm tired, they get cranky to live with, they start making bad decisions. So you've almost got the edges of it just starting to touch them. And, my grandfather, quite rightly he grew up in the Depression. He would have said to me if I was going through this, he'd have just said, toughen up, my boy. Should we just be telling ourselves to toughen up? And if not, why?
Look, I've heard that too. And I also had the cry, I'll give you something to cry about, I think part of the challenge is that amount of Australians not seeking help is really embedded in some of our culture in Australia, and particularly our rural culture. And so we've grown up where we're tough, we're told to toughen up, we're stoic, and also where our identity is often tied to what we do. We're not separated from that in rural areas. And when you couple that with the sort of adverse conditions that we deal with, I think it becomes that sort of perfect storm. And we have this culture where we're raised where emotions been equated to weakness and weakness is punished. Yeah. So we've got this situation where we won't ask for help because we see it as weakness. Yeah. And there's a price to pay for that. So the stigma around struggling is huge in rural areas. And I think to the second part of that question, Ben, is what we need to do is we need to reframe that culture, reframe success, reframe actually investing in ourselves is a strength, not a weakness. So the other component to that is increasing our mental health literacy, because we bandy those words around a lot. We see awareness campaigns that talk about mental health, and we can say those words and never actually have a conversation or understand what that is or what we need to do. Yeah. And I think sometimes that can be counterproductive. So I can wear a ribbon on my lapel, I can paint a tree blue, but if I've never had the conversation, how do I know what that is? How do I know how to get help? And how do I know how to support someone else to that? Yeah. So increasing that language around it, often we don't have language, but that's really important. And then we need to invest in the background around engagement with our communities and our relationships. They're really important things that we know are protective against developing illness and suicide, and really being that change that we want to see in our community.
It's interesting. There's a couple of things I just want to unpack there, Letitia. Is the first thing around is I'm a big advocate because I think language is incredibly important. You can make or break your situation just with the use of language. And one of the words that I love to use is prosperity rather than success. I talk about success a lot, but what I mean is prosperity. And so you can have someone that's really financially successful, but their family hates them, they're unwell, their health has suffered, maybe their mental health has suffered, there's all these sorts of things. Maybe people just think they're an arsehole, but they're financially successful. So I say our goal in life should be to be more prosperous, or we want a family that's more prosperous. And that means there has to be balance, and we have to be physically healthy, we have to be mentally healthy, we have to have good, strong communities, etc. And what I find, which I've found fascinating over the years, is these prosperous or successful people who run into burnout or their mental health starts to take a bit of a hit or get frayed around the edges is this guilt. And that's what I see as a really important part to this, is that I have the conversation with them and they sort of talk about I'm struggling to make good quality decisions. I'm unmotivated. I'm cranky to be around. And they go, but look at all this that I've got. I've got everything I possibly could have wanted. I've got a lovely family. I'm in relatively good health. I've got this great farm. I love what I do. So I feel so guilty. Do you find that's a common component for people out there in general?
Oh, definitely. And it's really hard because in order to do the stuff to look after yourself, you've actually got to park that guilt and that shame that you have about taking time for you. And I think the other challenge around our culture is that we value busy rather than effective or all the other hallmarks there. For me, it's really important to look at what success for me is having a crack. If I stuff up and I've had a crack, I've learned it, and that's a really good investment in my future because I've learned that lesson. So if I have a crack and learn something, but, in the traditional sense fail, then that's okay for me. That's my level of success. But I think it's important to reframe, what success is for you. And that's not what success is for Jonesy down the road. That's not what success for what the Instagram followers want. That is, what is it for you? What drives you? And how can I invest in myself as the primary person who is looking after my family, who's looking after my mates, who's looking after my businesses and my community? If I don't invest in me, I'm no good to anyone else. Yeah. And I think that taking time for yourself in this busy culture is something that's very shame-based. It's considered selfish.
Well, it's guilt-based too for me. I mean, if I'm not working and working really hard and I've got 1,000 things on the go at once, I just feel this rising sense of guilt that, I must be, and there's obviously the pre-programmed family history that, if you're not working your guts out, you must be a lazy bastard. And that starts to creep up. And then if you start to feel ragged around the edges, well, then all of a sudden it's like, well, you need to toughen it up and just push through. Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, 100%. That's how I was raised too. I've got a perpetual fear of laziness and I run at pace, and that's okay. But what I've also learned is that if I don't take time to do things for me, which is completely different from the generation before me, so I am changing the culture in our family that it's okay.
And I'm guessing you're struggling with that.
All these days, mate. I'm a masterpiece in progress, I reckon. So I don't have it all sorted out, but I am proactive and I'm creative and I'm committed to doing those things that keeps me mentally healthy, because I've been through challenges where I've been down, and that's not saying, we all go through mental health challenges, right? And people that say that they're never going to develop a mental health challenge, it's like saying I'll never have a physical health challenge. It's highly unlikely. And when you look at that 1 in 2 across our lifetime, I think it's really important that we do that we actually invest in that, because we can go through a period where things just aren't as good. So a mental health challenge is just that period where things aren't real good, yeah? And it's hard to get out of it and it's hard to see the upside to things.
And you start making poor decisions, or you struggle to make decisions.
Yeah, and it's because the whir in our head is overtaking our ability to do that, yeah? But I'm no good. I don't make good financial business decisions. I've got a couple of businesses. I don't make good decisions when I'm doing that. I don't make good decisions for my family. And then if I don't do that, I think I'm cheating people out of the best of me, yeah? If I've got too much on my plate and I'm not capable of carrying that, then everyone gets half-assed-ish, yeah, which isn't great. And I did a lot of years of that. I'd work my way through stress and just keep going, like you, just keep head down. Can't be a lazy bastards. Let's go. Let's roll. But ultimately it has a toll on you. And I think that's one of the key things. Just like I know that I need to eat well to maintain my physical health, I know that there's things that I need to do to keep the mental side of it rolling so that I can be the best for that, for my family, for my friends, for my businesses and for my community.
One of the words that I love to use also is resilience. I think for me, when I look at it, I believe stress or anxiety or whatever it is just a signal that things aren't right, and my resilience levels is dropping. And I find that the more stress that I come under, the less resilient I am with making decisions. And so that's the way I've always framed it. And I remember I've mentioned this before in the podcast, but my wife said to me once, I was under a fairly hefty amount of pressure because I love to put myself under pressure. I always say, like, I'm like a donkey. I need the stick. I need flogging with a stick to get the best out of me. But she said, it feels like sometimes, Ben, the business gets the best of you and we get the rest, and which is the crap. And I really start to notice that when I come home and I'm spending time with my daughter, my family, that's where it really starts to show when I'm overdone or overcooked. And then that's the signal that, hey, I'm not as resilient as I was before. I maybe need to make some adjustments. And for most people, my guess is at this, well, I don't know what the right word is here, Letitia, but the early stages of it, or the light end of the dysfunction, shall we call it, it could be a fairly easy fix. And for me, sometimes it's as simple as just taking a day off, I don't know, laying around watching a movie. The other thing is doing really heavy exercise is a really good reset for me. So I'm guessing there's just some small things you can do at the early stages to stave off, getting further into the hole, shall I say.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to look at it. If we invest in managing our stress early as a key component of our mental health, then we don't it's easy to step out of that hole. But if we dig it deeper with shame and blame and guilt and all that stuff, and sticking our head in the sand because there's no such thing as mental health when we grew up and all that sort of stuff, there's a much bigger impact, and it takes you a lot more to recover from it. And most of the stuff for managing your stress, the majority of it isn't rocket science, right?
I love when it's not rocket science.
Oh, mate, it's the little stuff that actually has a huge impact. We talk about stress a bit like a bucket, like having a bucket. We've all got a bucket of different size, and that's okay. It's about managing it, because there's those things that'll turn up all the time. So it's always this bucket's getting topped up, right, by the interest rates, the markets, your mum getting sick, your kids licking the windows at Coles and picking up COVID. Like these are all things. There's all this stress that keeps coming into the bucket, okay? And your wife needing something else, whatever that is, there's a whole range of stresses, right, that fill that up. And if we don't put a tap on the bottom and empty it out, then it's going to overflow. And what you're talking about, that period of poor mental health or struggling or that sort of thing, that becoming overwhelmed is your bucket overflowing, right? And some people do that in an explosive anger thing. Some people do it in a crying thing. And some people just go inside and the lights are on, but no one's home. Yeah, they really internalise that and just keep poking away. But the challenge is to turn that tap on down the bottom, right? And that we're all different, so that looks different for all of us. And the really great thing about that is that it's the things that you like doing. It's the things like it's the basics. So eating well, sleeping well. Limited alcohol is one of those things, if you're struggling, that we need to be conscious of. But it's doing things you get lost in. It's physical exercise. It's getting out and feeling the grass underneath your feet and not walking around in shoes all day. It's hugging your kids. For me, it's drinking a beer around the campfire with my mates.
Talking some rubbish with your friends.
Yeah. Telling dirty jokes, that's another thing that helps empty my bucket. Yeah. And then there's some other stuff there. So it can be things like maybe it might be doing a mindfulness practice. Now, I can't do an hour. I climb the walls, but I can do 5 to 10 minutes, and that can really decompress my mind. Talking to a psychologist is another one of those. Talking to a professional who's independent, who I don't have to protect.
Or worry about judgment.
Yeah, and no judgment. And just like I go and get a massage for my back physically, Yeah, I go and get a massage for my mind, and I go and talk to someone who might have more skills and knowledge than me to help me walk through a problem.
It's interesting. I when we were preparing for this, I was thinking back to that movie Crocodile Dundee. And I remember I went and saw it with my dad when I was a kid. And I remember, I'm probably going to paraphrase this or get it wrong, but it was something along the lines of, she talked about going and seeing a therapist. And he's like, well, what do you need a therapist for? And she goes, oh, well, you tell them their problems. And he says, oh, I just tell whoever his name was down at the pub. He tells everyone else, and then there is no problem.
No problem. Yeah, I think sharing with a mate can be really important because connections are key for us. We're social beings, right? So connections are key. Bob, who then goes and tells the rest of it, beat you back to town, is probably not the best option.
Not the best.
You're not going to be very open with him about the stuff that really matters. Yeah, but connections, finding someone to help hold that space, because sometimes I talk about it a bit like when I get a flat tire on my car, right? So when I get a flat tire, some days I can change that myself. Some days the nuts might be too tight and I might need to get a mate with a rattle gun to help me out. And sometimes the studs might be broken, right?
Or sometimes you might be in your frock to go to the races.
Been there, done that too, mate. But, sometimes I might need to go to someone who has more specialist knowledge than me, right? So like a mechanic. So some days I can do it myself. So I can do the lifestyle stuff. So I've been through a bit of a stressful time just lately. I'm making sure I'm sleeping. So I'm paying real attention to sleep, and it's the hardest thing I work on in my life. I'm not a good sleeper. So I actively invest in that. And making sure I'm eating well and I'm connecting with people I love, right? So there's 3 things that I'm doing that are helping me change that time myself. Sometimes I need to talk to a mate, and that's like someone with a rattle gun. Someone comes in and they just help hold whatever that is for me, yeah? And a mate to go, it's all right, I'm on your side. But some days when something's getting worse and I'm not quite sure how to handle it, I need to go to someone who has more specialist knowledge and skills and say, I'm not sure what to do, yeah? And I've worked as a therapist and I've never laid anyone on a lounge, so, not professionally. So sometimes people might need to unpack what's behind whatever that is, what's underlying that. But sometimes it's just about getting some tools and skills that can help deal with the symptomology, yeah, and move forward. And just like we collect skills around business, around finance, around, whatever that might be, we should be collecting those skill sets so that we've got a big range of things that we can call on, which brings us back to that resilience piece. Because if we have those skill sets, then we can move forward through change. And for me, that's what resilience is, our ability to move forward through change. And if we've been and collected a few more skills and tools and that sort of thing, then we're able to do that.
Now, let's put the human impact aside, because obviously we talked about the stats and how this has a massive impact on humans. Now, from a financial side of view, there's also some fairly significant impacts, isn't there? And you completed a research paper with the GRDC, I think it was, around the actual costs of stress and mental health on rural production. Can you just give us a bit of a brief rundown on that, Letitia? Because I really want people to think about, for some people like me, I can accept there's a human toll, but it also helps me take action when I understand there's a financial implication. It's almost like I'm doubling up on the reasons, if that makes sense. So yeah, can you just unpack that briefly for us, mate?
And I think it's sometimes it's easy to divorce ourselves from that idea that, the human impact when we're in business, because it's okay to do that in my personal life, but not in my business life. But PricewaterhouseCoopers and Beyond Blue did a great study back in 2014 that looked at some of those costs to Australian small business, and they put it at $10.9 billion a year that poor mental health is costing our businesses, and that's predominantly in productivity costs. When we break that up, $4.7 billion is around absenteeism. So that's, chucking a sickie. It's the days that we have off that we are completely out. But more concerning for me in the businesses I run and for anyone else running a business, we should be thinking about that the $6.1 billion that is presenteeism. So that's when I'm there, but I'm only about half effective. Now, let's be honest, we've all had those days.
Fridays.
Mondays aren't so cracking for me.
I'm right, Mondays.
Takes me a while to warm up. But, where you haven't been there, you've been there physically, but you haven't been at your best, and you walk away going, geez, I don't know that I earned that money this week, yeah? And often that's around a whole range of stress or adverse impacts in your life. But, you look at the cost of that, and that's not even looking at the impact on poor decision making.
Yeah, the lost opportunity, the opportunity cost, which is I missed that opportunity because I wasn't on my game. I made a poor decision there, which cost me money, or missed out on an opportunity, I think is massive. And I'd hate to even fathom what that would be costing.
Yeah, and most of our businesses are that, rarely, we do have a few $5 decisions that we have to make, but most of them are expensive decisions, right? And so if we're not able to bring the information together and to bring that information together and have a considered decision, then it really is a challenge for us. Yeah, and I think that there's a huge cost to that we don't often consider. But the other interesting thing about that is that we also know some of the stats are saying that the return on investment for every dollar that we put in at the front end, we're getting about $4.70 at the back end that we're saving in the cost to a business.
That's huge. And that would be just employees, wouldn't it, Letitia? That wouldn't be the business owners. If you did that same analysis with a business owner making strategic decisions, I think that number would be exponentially larger.
Oh, yeah. And I know myself, decisions that I've made that were lesser than, because I literally was not able to cope with the level of information that I needed to process. So I went with a gut feeling, or I went with a close enough's good enough. And I cheated my business out of success because of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I suppose from my point of view, Letitia, as we're getting older, because we went to university together, so we're the same age, there's no one sneaking out of this, things just start breaking. And what I've found as I've got older is physically I'm having to do more different and more exercise to try and counterbalance that. And I look at it this way. I go, well, my physical body is important, but in my business and my job, my mind is far more valuable to me than my body. I could still be a great coach and a good podcaster if I had no legs or something like that. Whereas if my mind's not quite as sharp as it should be. So I just see this as anyone who wants to be prosperous or successful, you need your mind to be sharp and you need it to be strong. And we should be focusing on building the strength of our mind, not just our bodies. And, Australia's going through an obesity epidemic. My guess is our minds are probably going through the same thing. So I'm all about action. So I believe that, we can look at these things for a while, but we need to have action to take so we can actually start to improve. And what I'd like to do is just get a couple of tips from you, mate, around probably the first one is if you're seeing someone in your family that's suffering or starting to, get frayed at the edges, how can they start to help them stop slipping further down? And then if we can go into the second part, which is if you feel you're going down there, is there anything else you can do?
Yeah, I think, thanks for throwing me under the bus there about my age too, mate. I like that. Nice dig at us. I think it's really important that we start the conversation. And so the first part of that is recognising, and we've talked about someone not travelling well, but let's talk about what that looks like. So the two biggest signs that someone's struggling, remember, we want to go upstream. We don't want to be catching people downstream. We want to be catching people early and having those conversations early. So when someone starts to struggle, we see the two leading symptoms, I suppose, signs that we see is that a significant change in mood or behaviour. And it's funny how that's come up in the conversation several times as we see that, if Fred down the road is a cranky bugger, but he's always been a cranky bugger, chances are he's just a cranky bastard, right? So that's okay. But if he was fairly happy-go-lucky, had a good outlook on life, and all of a sudden he's short, he's snappy, all those things, that's a significant change, right? So significant change in mood or behaviour. And the other one is around social isolation. So because we have that stigma and we have that culture about toughness, when someone starts to struggle, we do our best to keep our mask up, right? To not let anyone know. So we either do that because we're afraid of the judgment that we'll get around it, Or alternatively, we do it because we don't want to burden those closest to us, right? So the easiest way to do that is to remove ourselves from people. So, you might say, hey, mate, drop in, we'll have a cuppa. And I'll say, no, oh, mate, I've got some fencing to do. I can't do that. And then it might be your cousins ring you up and say they're going to get one of their kids christened, and how about you come out? No, I've got to look after. Oh, I can't. Work's too busy, And we make this myriad of excuses every time we're asked to do something. And so what happens is it stays weeks, months, years sometimes, and we've isolated ourselves away and we've removed ourselves from people. So it's a really good thing to look for that. And then we'll see significant changes in sleep, in appetite, and it's the extremes of that. It's eating the whole fridge, eating nothing. It's eating the whole fridge, it's eating nothing. It's sleeping all day, it's not sleeping at all. It's those extremes that we want to watch. And another one is something like losing interest in the things that normally interest us. So those sorts of changes are the things that we want to look out for. But the biggest thing is to trust your gut, right? It's that intuition thing. If you think someone's struggling, then you want to start the conversation. And that's what we can do for the people around us. And it's just a conversation. It's not that scary. We do it every day on other topics. We can do it on this. So the key is to ask the question. How I do that is I will say, I'm really worried about you because I've noticed this change. How are you travelling? It's pulling up and listening to the answer. So we ask the question, we listen, and it's not a competition. We're not into competitive suffering.
Because that's a major problem though, isn't it? Is because you get two people that have been struggling and then someone says, hey, mate, I'm worried about you. Here's someone that's going to listen to my woes.
Oh, yeah. And we get a little bit competitive about that. So we go, you've got it tough. You should listen to what I've got, yeah? And so when we're encouraging someone to seek help, we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth and we want to use it in that ratio. It's not a competition. It's about making them comfortable and not judging them so that they'll open up about that. Encourage them to support, and that can be as simple as looking after themselves. It can be going to the GP and getting yourself on a mental health care plan or a referral to a specialist clinician. Whatever that is, or whatever support suits them, I think is a really important thing because we all do things differently. The last bit of that is make sure we follow up. And that's just not give someone a crisis line. That's not saying, how I normally do that is I say, it's all right if you don't want to talk about this now or you think you're on top of it or whatever that is, but I'm here if that changes. And I'm going to check in. I'm not just going to give you a line to call. I'm going to pick up the phone or I'm going to drop in and I'm going to say, hey, we had that yarn. What's going on? How are you going? Did you go to the GP? Can I take you to the GP? Yeah? What do you need from me to help you do that? It's not about taking responsibility for their problems or trying to fix that because often we can't. They're bigger things than we are capable of as the average person. But it's literally about starting that conversation, asking the question, listening, encouraging someone to help, and then following up. It's that simple.
And I think a lot of people just to know someone actually cares and is noticed and wants to have a conversation and you can download, quite often that's a huge emptying of the bucket. Straight away it gives you that massive release to be, someone cares, someone's looking, someone's interested, someone wants to hear, what I'm struggling with. There's a lot of stigma attached with going the full hog, shall we say, on taking action. What's the smallest step someone can do? And excuse my ignorance, but if they wanted to chat to someone independent, how would they find that person? Like, is there I don't know, for the lack of a term, a website they can go to or a organisation that they can say, righto, I want to take the first step. I just want to download and have a chat with someone that's not even related to me in any way, shape or form. And I don't want to have to go to the GP and get referrals and all these sorts of things. Is there a simple way they can just pick up the phone and speak to someone or book a time to speak to someone?
Yeah, there is. There's a range of counselling services that are not-for-profit or online, And a great example of that is TAX, is one that's based out of Brisbane. The other thing you can do is you can pick up the phone to someone like me. I'm a rural mental health coordinator with RAMP, Rural Diversity Mental Health Program, and we can have that conversations and help find the things that can go around you, the right support for you, and make those links in. You can either ask for that advice from a GP or for someone like me, or you can look for what's available in your local area. But the key is to find what works for you. And what works for me might be different to what works for you. Yeah, just like with managing our stress, it might be different. And if we go to the first person, if we go to the first counsellor or the first psychologist and we think they're a dickhead, that's okay. Yeah, not everyone's going to click with everyone. That's okay, right? And it's just like, I talk about it a bit like if I've got pipes leaking under my house, right, and they're broken and I can't fix them, I call in a plumber. Now, if the first plumber comes and he does a really crap job, I don't just throw up my hands and go, well, bugger plumbers, I'm done with plumbers, because what will happen is the foundations will be undermined, right? Same with us. So just because you don't connect with the first person, you may not connect with the first doctor. That's okay. Be persistent, be proactive and committed, and find the person that works for you. Yeah, go and get another plumber to come in and fix those pipes for you.
I think that's some great advice. And I look at it, a lot of times with rural, it's family. It's, there's someone in the family or multiple people in the family. And quite often the stereotype for me is mums will say, I'm seeing my son struggling. They've come back to the farm. They're on the farm. They might be single. They're not sure which way they want to go. They might have had a marriage breakdown or something like that. Mum's really worried. So I think being able to have the conversation as a family and talk about resilience and strength of the mind, etc., can be really healthy, because that starts, like you said, changes the vernacular or starts the conversation in the family, which can have, some real long-term beneficial impacts. Would you suggest that's right, or is there some better ways a family could do it?
No, 100%. That's how we change that culture. That's how we make it okay for people to seek help, yeah? That's how we turn around that 2/3 of people don't seek help when they've got an illness. That's how we turn around the suicide, those preventable deaths, yeah, is by having the conversation. And it's that simple. If you need to show leadership, like within your family, within your friends, within your community. And it's our responsibility to do that, each of us, to step up and do that. And it's as simple as we come back to that language piece. If we start to have conversations, we've got language when we struggle. If we start to have those conversations, we know it's okay to talk about it. So when we are struggling, we will reach out. And the majority of people that actually get to help have done so because someone close to them has encouraged them. And the other, here's the kicker to this one, Ben, is that we need to model that behaviour that we want to see in our community. Because it's really easy to say it's okay to get help. But if you are not seen to do that, then it's hard for people. You can be what you can see. And that one came home to me. My eldest son, I come from a pretty tough background, and I have done the work around that, and I've done a lot of stuff to work on me, right? But my young fellow was going through a really tough time, and he wouldn't ask for help. And when it finally came out, and I was sitting down to him and I said, mate, like, why didn't you ask for help? Like, what's that about? And he turned around and he said, but Mum, you've never asked for help. And it broke my heart, right? Because I went and got help, and I asked for help, and see, it has a response to me already. But I asked for help and I did that, but I did it quietly, because there's still that shame and that selfishness associated with it, and guilt, yeah? And so whilst he needs, and I'd prided myself, I'm a strong individual, and I prided myself on showing him strength. But what I didn't realise is he needed to see the vulnerability of me too. Whilst he needs me strong, he needs me to show him it's okay to ask for help. And so now we do that. I talk about where I stuff up, that's okay, and where I ask for help. And so it creates a culture because I now talk about that. It's broken that. And hopefully when he grows up, he knows that it's okay to ask for help. And whether that's my nieces, my nephews, my family, my mates, I hope that for me, that conversation means it's okay for them to reach out. And that's what makes this better. That's where we can have an impact as an individual, because sometimes we think the problem's just too big for us, right? And I think when we hear some of those big stats at the start, that we think that I can't have an impact on that suicide rate, but I can by having a conversation, by modelling that behaviour, by making it okay, and being part of that change that I want to see in my community.
I think that's a beautiful one, the leadership, be the change you want to see. I quite often talk about, the old analogy when you're on an aeroplane and you've got your little toddler sitting beside you and the aeroplane's going to crash and the oxygen mask drop down. You're supposed to put them on yourself first and then your toddler, not the other way around. And for obvious reasons, if you've passed out for lack of oxygen, you can't help your children. And I think the same should be for a family. If you're seeing someone in the family struggling, well, be the example to them. And because I'm sure everyone has had challenges, and talking about it normalises it, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you realise that you're not the only one going through it. Because when we were kids, Ben, no one talked about it. Yeah? No one spoke about, and, we saw I saw the pointy end of that with people not talking about it and how unwell they became or losing people. And so I think that it's really important to do that. And I call that the Qantas principle, mate. You're no good to anyone else if you're not breathing. Yeah. So there's a reason they say to put the mask on yourself first. And I really encourage people to think about investing in themselves that way, because I'm no good to my family, to my friends, my businesses and my community if I'm not looking after me.
Well, I think that's the gold nugget for me out of this whole podcast, Letitia, is model the behaviour you need to see. I think that's such a beautiful quote that I think would be very poignant for many problems that we have out there. So that would be really important. Well, look, that's been absolutely fantastic, Letitia. I know you're passionate about this, and I know you're really passionate about men's mental health as well. We had a great conversation the other day, which I wish we could have recorded, which was a shame. But before we tie this off, is there anything else you'd like to add before we tie it off?
No, I think it's just that encouragement that this isn't rocket science. Like, it doesn't have to be scary, and we can make a real change through starting those conversations, trusting our intuition, starting those conversations, asking the question, listening, encouraging support and following up. That makes a huge change. And the other piece of that is that we need to be investing in ourselves and managing that stress component so that we reduce our chances of developing an illness. So for me, they're the real kickers.
Yeah, perfect. Well, that's a great note to end on. So where can people find more about you online or about RAMP?
Look, you can find more information about RAMP at www.ramhp.com.au. It's an unusual acronym, but RAMHP is what that is. And we work in that awareness, education, and having the conversations to make sure people are supported to help. And my contact details are there.
Fantastic. So it's the Rural Adversity Mental Health Program, which I'm sure Dr. Google will be able to bring up for them as well if they can't get the acronym right, because I probably wouldn't.
100%. Yep.
Yeah. Perfect. Now, there's one question I want to ask you just before we go. I've given you notice on this, so hopefully you've had some time to think about it. But if you could go back in a time machine, now remembering you'd be back to, let's say, to between 20 and 25 when we knew each other back then, what's one piece of advice you give 25-year-old Letitia?
Ooh, I don't know that she'd listen.
She probably wouldn't. But what would you try and beat into her?
Yeah, I think for me, it's that you are enough, you do enough, you are worthy. So step into your space, sign on and get it done.
Yep. Well, you're a doer. I've always known that. So I don't think there's any problem there, but I love that. That's fantastic.
I think I've spent way too much time, in that doubting stuff that we do. We all have those things, and we just need to front up. We need to face up and get on having a crack at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a shame. We were saying this morning that, what is it? Youth is wasted on the young. It's such a shame we have to spend 10, 15, 20 years, learning these lessons. It'd be lovely if we could learn them when we were much younger. So that's what this podcast is all about.
I think it's great though, because mate, it's no matter what it is, if we pick up those tools, if we pick up a couple each year that we start to just put into that kit, we've got more to fall back on when things are tough or to help us slingshot forward. So that's exciting.
Fantastic. Well, look, I know you're a very busy woman and you've got a lot on your plate at the moment, so I'm going to finish off now. My alarm went off telling me I've got to go pick up my daughter from school so I can get cracking as well. So thank you very much. That's been super enjoyable, and at some stage we'll get you back on again because I'd love to dig into a few of those bits and pieces a bit further.
Yeah, great, Ben. It's always a pleasure, mate. And hopefully it's helped.
Well, that was a cracker of an episode just because we had a cracker of a guest yet again. Letitia really knows her stuff and she absolutely cares about all this sort of stuff. Now, there's a couple of points I just want to leave before we go, just to reinforce them. The first one is if you're starting to get a bit frayed around the edges, you're struggling to make good quality decisions, you're feeling a bit burnt out, you're struggling to get out of bed or to get as motivated as you used to be, I think there's some real value in naming that and saying, I'm just not as resilient or as strong as I usually am. And then I think once you've named it and accepted that, is we need to be thinking along the lines of, how do I strengthen my mind just like we'd strengthen our body? Now, I've got a bung knee from playing football back in the day that's finally given way, that I've got to essentially work on keeping strong. I've had some back injuries over my time, and as I'm getting older, things just aren't bending and working as well as they used to. So I invest a fairly significant amount of time keeping my body strong. I think we also have to think about keeping our mind strong, because as Letitia talked about, this is not only going to have a personal impact on you and your family, the prosperity that you feel, it's also going to have a significant opportunity or a significant opportunity cost on your business. If you're a business owner and you're making $10,000 an hour decisions when you're strategizing in your business, if you're not at your peak performance, you're going to make bad choices, or you're not going to make choices at all. So I think it's really important that you think about, how do I get a strong mind? And if you are struggling, is reach out for help. Have a conversation with someone and say, hey, I'm just not at my best at the moment, because I guarantee you, if you talk to one of your mates, they're probably going to be in the same position. And then make sure if you see anyone else that's struggling, you have that conversation and point them in the right direction. Because as Letitia said, we have to change the conversation around this. Well, the best thank you can give us if you enjoyed this episode is to share it with your family and friends. We'd be eternally grateful. We've got somewhere between, or any given month, between 5,500, 6,000 and 8,500 people a month are downloading the podcast, which is amazing. So that's all thanks to everyone sharing the episode and finding more listeners for the podcast. So that's about it for today. I'm done. I'm going out to build my mental resilience to spend some time with my daughter. So have a great couple of weeks, and we'll see you next time.